Hey guys, so we're going to go ahead and finish up our progressive notes. This is 2 of 2 of the 2 lectures that you need to listen to as the supplemental lectures. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to finish up that chart that I was talking about previously for the progressive era. So we're going to start at the very front, and then we're just going to work through each of the boxes that are left. So one of the really important things that's going to happen during this time are labor unions and the establishment of a labor union. So first we need to understand what a labor union even is before we can actually understand the history of what happened at this time. So labor unions are any sort of a group that's able to legally come together or is allowed by a company in order to advocate for workers' rights. Now, labor unions itself are very controversial. You could ask 2 different adults what their opinion is on labor unions, and you're more than likely going to get 2 different responses. The most common labor unions that you're going to see are especially through public employees. So, for example, teachers are able to unionize depending on your state. So, in a more liberal state, you're likely to be able to have laws that require unions for regular companies, but public employees tend to be the most common. And what a labor union basically attempts to do is you pay your union dues, and they are going to advocate for your rights as a working class. Now, some labor unions are really, really strong, and some labor unions are not very successful. Some companies also don't allow labor unions, and some states, such as Utah, don't have a lot of labor union rights. So, for example, you can have a labor union, but you can't strike in Utah. You have the ability to be fired if you decide to go on strike. And so to give you a really good example of this idea of labor unions and their controversy, a couple of years ago there was this really big thing called Red for Ed. There was multiple states that were really doing a whole bunch of strikes and things like that in order to be able to get higher pay and different things like that. And in some of the states, so for example, in Chicago, they walked out for, I think it was 6 weeks, and they were on strike for 6 weeks until they came up with a bargaining agreement. Here in Utah, we don't have that ability to do that. We're a right-to-work state, which means that if you choose not to go to work, they can fire you for that reason. A good example of this actually happened in Florida. So last year, or 2 years ago, right before COVID, there was a really big push in Florida for different things to happen, more money, different things like that. And then there was an email that was sent out that there was allegedly going to be a strike. And then what they said they were going to do is they were going to, so you can see it says illegal strike right here. They were going to either give them a fine or also possibly result in their termination. At the same exact time, there was another organization that there was a newspaper that published all the names of teachers that called out sick on a certain day. It's called the sick out. But we are a right-to-work state, which means you can't do that. Another example is, as well with labor unions, is if your strike interferes with the public good, they can break up the strike. So a great example of this is federally. Back in the 80s, there was a big pilot strike where all the pilots went on strike. However, the federal government said that was interfering with the federal government, and so they broke up the strike and they fired everybody. So labor unions can work. It could also not work. It just depends on the situation. So really the HC of all this labor union stuff is going to be the Second Industrial Revolution, the robber barons, and things like that of these bad working conditions. So labor unions are going to get created, and the most popular one that you're going to hear about is the Knights of Labor. If you want to go ahead and star, this was easily the most powerful labor union that existed for several years. Part of the reason why it was so successful is it included both, if you will highlight, included skilled and unskilled workers regardless of race or gender. So this was one of the most inclusive ones, which is why it became so popular. The next one that we're going to talk about is what's called the AFL, which is the American Federation of Labor. This one also lasted a significant amount of time, and if you notice this really big rapid increase at the start of the century. And the AFL really was focused specifically on, so the Knights of Labor were far less violent. They didn't do a lot of violent strikes. The AFL, though, however, was mostly the industrial workers. So if you notice, the industrial workers protecting all of the others. However, they did have a lot of violence as well. The most famous one that you're going to get from this, and you can see that you have this smaller elite craft unions that start this. It was exclusive to certain people. If you will highlight Samuel Gomper, he's a really popular one that's a sourcing. So while the Knights of Labor is the more popular term, Samuel Gomper is oftentimes used as a sourcing for labor unions. Then you have the IWW, which you can put next to, this is a lot of people relate this to communism or Bolshevism. It becomes very controversial after World War I. And trying to be able to bring all the nation's workers into this one giant thing to create a whole different economy of socialism and communism in the United States. And one of the real big reasons why people started to dislike labor unions was, one, fear of anarchy and violence, and two, was fear of foreign influence, especially communism, Bolshevism, and what they considered anarchy. So you can see right here the IWW is bringing unionism in, and it's going to destroy capitalism, and capitalism is preventing all these other people, you have the octopus that's taking over all these other people, so you can see that it's taking this away and it's going to kill capitalism. Now, the Socialist Party is the one I would star. It's easily the most successful party that continues up until today. If you want to highlight, is a guy named Eugene Debs. He really advocated for government ownership of everything as well as common salary. And the Socialist Party really sparked that idea of commonality, so it really resonated with the poor and the middle class. Let me give you an example of basically how this works. So in capitalism, you have 4 different employees that make a certain amount of money. We're going to say this is how much they make. In capitalism, that's how much they make. However, in socialism, all the money is pooled into one area, and instead it's split amongst the group, and therefore it becomes $30,000. This is most beneficial for the lower class, and most of the biggest hit is going to be for the upper class. But that's how socialism works. Now, Eugene Debs is a really interesting character. He became very, very famous for socialism, but again, people became very fearful, especially of Eastern European influence, where a lot of those ideas came from. And so he ends up getting arrested for being possibly an anarchist. He was accused of being an anarchist because of his beliefs. And interesting fact, while he was in jail, he won 2nd place in a presidential election because he was arrested for anarchy. Now, then we're going into the strikes, and the strikes are more the one I would know. So the most famous ones you're going to know are like Knights of Labor. You might see Samuel Gomper, or you might see Eugene Debs. But the strikes are going to be the one that are the most popular. So these are going to be where they're going to come together and they're going to attempt to strike. And a strike is basically where you walk off the job or you stop doing something, whatever it could possibly be. So it kind of starts with the Great Railroad Strike. Notice really quickly that date. We had some people that were talking about the progressive DBQ and asking about labor unions. The issue is most of those are out of the time period, but it could be used as an HC. And so the Great Railroad Strike is going to be where basically there was all these pay cuts, and I'm talking about really, really severe pay cuts, where it was really detrimental and they were making very few money. And so basically what ended up happening is the workers ended up they walked off the job, and then when they didn't get what they wanted to, they set the railroads on fire, and eventually the militia broke them up. It kind of became the contextualization for our next one, which is going to be the Haymarket Strike. And the Haymarket Strike was really unique, though, because really, if you want to put next to the Haymarket Strike, this is the major reason why people feared labor unions. So basically what happens is this. They're wanting to be able to get more rights, and there's a local labor union that wants to be able to advocate for these rights, so they're going to do a rally at a place called the Haymarket Square. Well, when they have this rally, they have this big rally, everybody leaves, and all of a sudden a bomb is going to go off. Well, once that bomb goes off, everybody blames the anarchists and everybody blames the labor union and the leaders of the labor union were executed by hanging. And while there's no evidence that they specifically contributed to this, it really increased the fear of immigrants that these people who have bombs and are going to kill us all and things like that. And it really struck fear, and especially became a lot of nativist of fear of foreign political ideas. The Homestead Strike is the one that we've already talked about before. That's the one I would star. The Haymarket Square and the Homestead Strike are both very, very popular, which we've already talked about this one, so I'm not going to focus on it too much. The Pullman Strike is a similar situation where at the Pullman factory you were required to live in the worker town, and what happened is during the Pullman Strike they reduced wages but massively increased rent, and you were required to live there in order to be able to have a job. Eventually the president ordered troops to break this up, and this is really where socialism rises, is out of this idea of super low wages and not being able to afford things as well. Now, the reason we care about the Pullman Strike is mostly because of this political cartoon, so you can actually, right next to it, remember the political cartoon. It's one of the most popular ones that you'll see for labor unions, even if it has nothing to do with Pullman, which you can see Pullman right here, but you can guess labor unions from this, so you can see you have the worker, high rent, low wages, and being squished in between. So now we're heading into our next section, which is going to be religious reform, which is actually one of my favorite sections, but we didn't do it in person, which is totally okay. So religious reform is really going to spark where you have all of these different people that are really going to use religion as a justification for reform. So if you want to put next to this is religious justification, using a religion to say this is why I need to do things. So the first thing is going to be the YMCA, which you might have heard of this before, and the YMCA is, and let me make sure because I'm just realizing that the blank is incorrect. 1 second. So this is supposed to be the Young Men's Christian Association. That's the blank for this one. So the Young Men's Christian Association is going to be basically this organization that's going to attempt to be able to help people who are struggling, and especially at the beginning as men, and then eventually it changes to the Young Women's Christian Association. Now, if you have ever done the Just Dance or have ever heard the song YMCA, you probably know this and you never realized it was actually a really good sourcing for this class. So if you read the lyrics, you'll see it says, young man, there's no need to feel down, pick yourself up off the ground, you're in a new town, there's no need to be unhappy. So obviously you got this guy that's upset. It says there's a place you can go when you're short on your dough. What does that mean? That means you don't have enough money. You can get yourself clean, you can have a good meal, you can do whatever you feel. What is this? It's basically an original form of a homeless shelter, but it was formed by the Christian church. So basically what happened is Christian churches began to fund this. It became a homeless shelter. It also became a place to recreate. It began to improve the lives of individual cities, where they would target communities that were high in poverty, but now it was very cheap to get workout equipment and to be able to be in sports. And then it began to rise from there and eventually had the YWCA, and then eventually came back together from reducing that, and now it's just the YMCA without the affiliation of men or female. Now, the Salvation Army became another great example. Obviously, you could tell salvation is going to be through the religion. You know them best from the bell ringers at Christmas time that collect money as well. They look like this. Now, one of my favorite things that the Salvation Army would do are these things called slum brigades. So they would go to tenement areas or slums, and they would have a 24-hour service fest where everybody would do service to one another and improve the community, and then they would leave in 24 hours with the place in better condition than when they came. Now, the social gospel is one that I would double star. It's one of the most important terms on this entire paper packet. And the social gospel is going to come from this guy who most students consider to be the most attractive guy that we learned about in this class. And he had this idea of the social gospel. His name is Walter Rauschenbach, by the way. And so he's German. And he had this idea that you, as a Christian, you follow Christ. And what did Christ do in his lifetime? He gave service. So what should you do if you want to be like Jesus? And what would Jesus do? You would do service. That's the idea of the social gospel. So social gospel is basically, Salvation Army, by the way, I don't think I had this here. So the blank for social army is going to be while preaching Christianity and morality. Social gospel is movement led by Protestant Christians. That's your blank as well. And so what people do is this is really justifying doing charity by religion. So one of my favorite examples is when people say, in order to be a Christian, you need to do charity work. That's an idea of the social gospel. Or if you ask people, why are you doing charity? Because that's what Jesus would do. That's the social gospel. Now, the gospel of wealth is a guy we've already talked about before. If you want to go ahead and double star that one too and highlight that one even, that one's really important. So this guy's Andrew Carnegie, which you guys already know about. So he had all that wealth. He gave it all away. And he creates this book called The Gospel of Wealth. And in The Gospel of Wealth, it basically is trying to convince wealthy owners to give away their money and give back to the community. So here's a great example of this. This was a local GoFundMe from a couple of years ago where there was a family, she ended up having a stroke and was permanently disabled. They did a GoFundMe, and then all of a sudden you had this pop up, which is Taylor Swift donating $15,000 to this family. This was in Ogden, I think it was. And basically, this is the idea of the social gospel. You've been given this gift by God to have money, and so according to the social gospel, you need to give it back and donate it and do charity work and different things like that with your income. Now, the Gospel of Wealth, which you can put in that blank, is Andrew Carnegie. And again, this is the idea of that wealthy responsibility. And he tried to convince people, which again would be that captive industry. However, many people rejected it and said that this was not something that they wanted to do. Now, in terms of environmental reform, so we're skipping quite a bit into the very last page. So environmental reform really goes with Teddy Roosevelt, which we would have done this in Teddy Roosevelt if we had had enough time. So here's basically what happened. So Theodore Roosevelt was very well known for being an outdoorsman. One of my favorite things about Teddy Roosevelt is the fact that he actually had a working ranch while he was in the presidency. And so for 6 months out of the year, he would go work on the working ranch and just like see ya for 6 months out of the year so that he could work on his ranch during the middle of his presidency. I like to think of it like today, like imagine if like Biden or Trump just like left for 6 months to go work at their business. Everybody would freak out. But at this time, nobody cared. Everybody loved Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt was very well known for being that outdoorsy guy. This is, by the way, one of my favorite Photoshops. It was Photoshopped to make him seem very manly. And we'll talk about the bull moose in just a little bit. But you might say, so where did he get the nickname Teddy? The nickname Theodore did not have any relation to Teddy until Teddy Roosevelt. So the famous story is that he was an extremely famous hunter. He loved to hunt. He's an outdoorsman. And Teddy Roosevelt is going to go hunting, and he was searching for a bear. He went days and days and days and couldn't find it. And eventually somebody says, I found a bear, and they had captured it, tied it up to a tree, and gave him his gun and said, shoot the bear, Mr. Roosevelt. And instead, he famously turned away and he says, I will not do that. That's inappropriate. And that famous story got transmitted to this toy maker that was in New York. And he said, oh, we could make a thing called the teddy bear and name it after Theodore Roosevelt. And this became the very first teddy bear. So if you've ever had one, it's named after Theodore Roosevelt because of his love of the outdoors and this famous story as well. Well, Theodore Roosevelt, as we know, is very, very famous. If you want to put it next to Theodore Roosevelt, he was a Republican. And this would be, by the way, a modern-day Democrat. So to give you a little bit of an idea, is a modern-day Democrat. And so what happens is that Theodore Roosevelt really was the progressive president. So whenever you think of progressive movement, the number one thing you have to think of is Teddy Roosevelt. Well, there was a lot of issues with the environment during this time. People were moving west, people were overgrazing, the cities were completely polluted due to sewage, people were destroying the planet. And this really caused an issue for Theodore Roosevelt because remember, he was the outdoorsman. He wanted to keep that nature. Well, what happens is, remember the bully pulpit before? He talked about how he had this duty in order to be able to help the people. That's the bully pulpit idea. And one of those peoples is going to be a guy by the name of John Muir. Here's a guy I would star. John Muir was a conservationist, so advocated for conservation. And John Muir was a conservationist. He actually founded a thing, if you want to next to his name, called the Sierra Club, which is the Sierra Nevadas. And he was really advocating this, and he wanted to teach Teddy Roosevelt about conservation and why things need to be preserved. And so he invited Teddy Roosevelt for a 3-month camping trip in the middle of his presidency. So again, Teddy Roosevelt leaves for 3 months, and he goes on a camping trip with John Muir. And he goes famously to Yosemite, which is what you're seeing in the backgrounds, and the Sierra Nevadas, which is what John Muir's pinnacle was. He loved that as well. And Teddy Roosevelt realized he needed to do something. So in collaboration with John Muir, he's going to advocate, so there's the Advocate for Conservation. He advocates for 2 major laws, which are ones that you can use on your DBQ if you would like, because they're both in the time period. So the first one is what's called the Antiquities Act. And both of these laws, by the way, we really care about here in Utah, because, for example, the Antiquities Act is going to be the federal conservation of lands in the West. And the Antiquities Act is basically to guarantee that certain areas are protected for future use. So to give you some idea, this is Utah or just the Western United States. Everything in color here is owned by the federal government. Utah actually as a state owns less land privately and by the state government than federally. So federally, I think it's like 60% of the land is owned by the federal government here in Utah. So let's talk about some lands that have been preserved and set away. Now these could be things that are like national landmarks. These should be national recreation areas, national forest areas. So let's see if you know where these places are as designated by the Antiquities Act for preservation in Utah. So this is Flaming Gorge. See this one? This one's a little bit harder. This is the Bear River Migratory, which is up in Brigham City, and Mirror Lake. So all these are areas that have been designated for conservation by the federal government, which is why you have to pay a fee when you go up into the Uintas. Now, the Antiquities Act also did another thing. It designated national landmarks and monuments. So this is the Devil's Tower, which is right on the border of Utah and Arizona, and then Dinosaur National Monument. So all of these are done by the Antiquities Act. All the time there's landmarks, monuments being designated, not just naturally, but homes and houses and things like that that are also preserved. Then we had the creation of the National Park Service, and the National Park System was really from before, but it was massively expanded to the system that we know today of the designation of national parks. The very first national park of that is going to be Mesa Verde. If you've heard that that Yellowstone is going to be the first national park, that is true. It's the first designated park, but it is not the first official one by the national park system. An interesting fact, if you ever are curious about ways you can remember John Muir, when you go to Disneyland, it's all over the bathrooms at Disneyland, right outside of Soarin'. So if you ever go outside of Soarin', you can go and you can see the beautiful pictures of John Muir right outside the bathroom, and you can think about him. Now, I think I mixed up my order, but that's okay. So the progressive presidents that you need to know about. So easily the most famous progressive president is going to be Theodore Roosevelt. However, Roosevelt is going to leave office. So in 1908, he leaves office, and his vice president easily gets elected, who's William Howard Taft. Teddy Roosevelt then decides that he is going to go on a trip because he's just finished 8 years as the presidency. He could have gone for more, but he said, I will keep with tradition. And so he actually goes on a trip to Africa for almost 9 months. And he's just kind of like by himself. He comes back from Africa to this huge accolade in New York City by ship. But he's looking for his friend William Howard Taft, who he hasn't seen or heard from in a long time. Well, he gets off the ship and William Howard Taft isn't there. And he starts to realize that his best friend that he had had for a long time and really heavily respected may not have been the actual best friend that he knew. Both of them went to Ivy League schools. When Roosevelt was in Ivy League, he didn't really have to try at all. He was very, very popular. Like we talked about before, he was the boxing champion in the Navy. He was extremely popular and well-liked, and he didn't really care about his studies because he didn't have to try hard. And he was super attractive to a lot of people. In contrast, William Howard Taft, he was originally extremely skinny. He later became overweight. His parents hounded him all the time. He was very, very shy, and he was not very popular. 1 second.
Teachers, if you're scheduled to work tonight's basketball game, can you text Linda Tierney? If you're one of the people scheduled to work the basketball game tonight, besides Shonda. Shonda, I know your name. Could you text Linda Tierney? Thank you.
So regardless, though, is that when he returns, he realizes, so in theory, you have these two polar opposites that are going to join together as the president and vice president. He thought he had set him up. It's very similar to like Obama, how he had been working with him to be able to have Biden possibly become a future president, and he had prepped him for presidency, expecting him to continue that. However, William Howard Taft wasn't that at all. William Howard Taft reversed many of Roosevelt's policies. He was extremely conservative. In comparison, he said that he was a Republican, modern day Democrat, but definitely more bordered along the line of a Democrat, although he considered himself a Republican. He did raise the tariff, which is really his only major progressive idea, but he really wasn't anything that Roosevelt thought he was going to be. And so because of that, that's what I was talking about. I accidentally did put it in twice. And so what ends up happening is that Roosevelt in 1912 decides that he is going to run for president again. And so he runs for president on this platform known as the Bull Moose Party. And the reason it was called a bull moose is, like I said before, you have that picture of the bull moose. But then what happens is that Roosevelt famously gets shot on the campaign trail, but he continues his speech for 84 minutes before eventually going to the hospital. And famously, people said it's going to take more than a bullet to shoot this bull moose. And that's where the Bull Moose Party came from. You can also put next to the Bull Moose Party that this was the Progressive Party. And he's going to basically go under this idea of bringing it back. As you can see the square deal all around. You can see you have the bull moose, that is kind of the compromise between Republicans and Democrats of trying to come up with a general idea of how it would split. Unfortunately, this splits the Republican Party. And because it splits the Republican Party, very similar to the election of 1860, where it split the Democratic Party, is that Wilson is going to win the presidency, even though the Republicans should have easily won, but nobody knew what to do. And it was a pretty bitter fight. It's actually really sad. Both of them saw each other as best friends until Roosevelt left the presidency, and then it's kind of a little bit of a sad fact. So eventually Roosevelt dies, and Taft refuses to go to his funeral, and famously Taft later on said that the worst decision I ever made was not going to his funeral. It's either that or it's the other way around. I can't remember which one died first. Anyways, And so he had this idea of progressivism, combining everything he needed to do. He was very much a moderate of trying to combine both ideologies in order to win this, but again, Wilson wins the presidency instead. And so Wilson is going to establish this new thing called New Freedom, which is his version of progressivism, but again, he mostly dealt with antitrust as well as increasing the tariff and reforming banking and currency. His most famous creation is going to be the Federal Trade Commission, as well as you can also put next to Wilson the Federal Reserve System. And the Federal Trade Commission is what we talked about before of regulating unfair trade practices, which right now with the whole thing with stock market, they're investigating that right now. But if you also want to put next to Richard Wilson, while he did have some things like the FTC, he was very, very racist. As in, if you go and look at his history, he really disliked people who are black in particular. He made extremely derogatory terms. You can put next to, and every single president had an issue. Theodore Roosevelt, for example, when he was in the Navy, he got a black regiment in pretty big trouble. But Wilson really, and you guys saw it on the DBQ, he really didn't like people who were black, and he refused to desegregate. And so you could put next to him that he really did not help progressivism at all for people who are black. Heading into the last one, because I told you I got it wrong. So we have all these famous suffragettes, and we're going to really focus on suffrage more in the 1920s, but since it's technically progressivism, we'll add it in here. So you can put that Alice Paul, Carrie Chapman, Kat, and Margaret Sanger were all famous, what's called a suffragette. And then the 19th Amendment is going to grant women the right to vote, but we are going to heavily talk about that later, so I'm not going to focus on it right now, but there's your blanks.